The sound of Patricia Middleton's manicured fist pounding on my cabin door at 7 in the morning could wake the dead. Through the peephole, I could see her standing there in her designer athleisure wear, perfectly coiffed blonde hair catching the early sunlight, holding what looked like official paperwork in one hand and her phone in the other. Behind her stood two equally overdressed women I recognized as her HOA board cronies, Linda Foster and Margaret Chen, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Harrison, I know you're in there," Patricia called out, her voice carrying that particular blend of entitlement and barely controlled rage that I'd come to associate with our interactions. "We need to discuss your immediate compliance with the emergency lake access ordinance passed last night. You have 24 hours to vacate this property or face criminal trespassing charges." I opened the door slowly, koffiemug in hand, taking in the scene with the calm that comes from 30 years of dealing with difficult people in corporate boardrooms. Patricia's face was flushed with the kind of anger that suggested she'd been working herself up to this confrontation for hours. The emergency ordinance she mentioned was news to me, but knowing Patricia's history of manufacturing crises to get her way, I wasn't particularly surprised. "Good morning, Patricia," I said evenly, not moving from the doorway. I wasn't aware the Pine Lake HOA had the authority to declare emergencies or issue eviction notices. Last I checked, this cabin and the 5 acres around it are still deeded in my family name, just like they have been since 1962. Her eye twitched at my use of her first name instead of the Mrs. Middleton she preferred, and I could see her phone screen lighting up as she prepared to make good on whatever threat she'd been planning. That's when I realized this wasn't just another one of our routine disputes about dock permits or property line maintenance. Patricia Middleton was making her final play for my family's lakefront property, and she'd convinced herself that intimidation and manufactured legal pressure would succeed where 3 years of harassment had failed. What Patricia didn't know was that I'd been expecting this moment for months, and I'd spent considerable time and money preparing for exactly this kind of escalation. The cabin sits on 5 acres of prime lakefront property that my grandfather, Samuel Harrison, purchased in 1962 for $800 from a farmer who needed quick cash. Back then, Pine Lake was just a fishing spot known mainly to locals, surrounded by working farms, and accessible only by a dirt road that turned to mud every spring. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom structure with a stone fireplace, wraparound porch, and a dock that my grandfather built by hand using lumber from trees he'd cleared himself. I inherited the property when my grandfather passed in 2018, along with his meticulously kept records documenting every improvement, every tax payment, and every interaction with local authorities spanning 60 years. By then, Pine Lake had transformed into one of Colorado's premier vacation destinations, with luxury homes selling for millions and a waiting list for boat slips that stretched years into the future. The HOA had formed in 2015 when enough expensive homes had been built around the lake to justify the bureaucracy. Though my property predated any covenants by decades, my first interaction with Patricia Middleton came 6 months after I inherited the cabin. She'd shown up unannounced on a Saturday morning, much like today, except her approach had been friendly and neighborly. She introduced herself as the HOA president and welcomed me to the community, mentioning casually that several homeowners had expressed interest in purchasing my property for well above market value. The offer was generous, she explained, because my rustic cabin didn't quite fit the aesthetic vision the community was trying to maintain. I'd politely declined, explaining that the cabin held tremendous sentimental value and that I planned to retire there eventually. Patricia's smile had faltered for just a moment before returning, brighter and more artificial than before. She'd mentioned that the HOA was always available to help with any questions about community standards and regulations, and suggested I review the covenants carefully to ensure my property remained in compliance. The first violation notice arrived 2 weeks later. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach, citing 17 separate infractions ranging from unapproved dock coloration to excessive vegetation impeding community sightlines. Each violation carried a fine between $50 and $500, with escalating penalties for non-compliance. The total came to $4,200, due within 30 days, with interest accruing daily thereafter. I'd called the number on the letterhead and reached Patricia's assistant, a nervous-sounding woman named Carol, who explained that all violations had been documented during a routine community inspection and were subject to immediate enforcement under the Emergency Powers Clause of the HOA Charter. When I asked to see the documentation, Carol transferred me to Patricia's voicemail, which was full. That evening, I drove to Patricia's house, a 6,000-square-foot McMansion that dominated the lake's eastern shore. She answered the door in tennis whites, fresh from what was apparently a private lesson on the court behind her house. Her attitude was different now, more businesslike and considerably less friendly than during our first meeting. "Mr. Harrison," she'd said, not inviting me inside. "I assume you're here about the violation notice? I should mention that disputing valid citations can result in additional administrative fees." I'd handed her a folder containing copies of my grandfather's original deed, the property survey from 1962, and documentation showing that my dock had been registered with the county before the lake's first HOA meeting had even been scheduled. I'd also included a polite letter from my attorney, James Morrison, noting that any attempt to enforce HOA covenants against property that predated the association by 53 years would constitute harassment under Colorado state law. Patricia had glanced through the documents with the kind of dismissive speed that suggested she wasn't actually reading them. "These look like copies," she'd said finally. "We'll need certified originals before any exemption claims can be considered. In the meantime, the fines remain in effect and continue accruing interest." That's when I'd realized Patricia Middleton wasn't interested in reasonable compromise or legal precedent. She wanted my property, and she was prepared to use every tool at her disposal to make my life miserable until I agreed to sell. Over the next 2 years, the harassment escalated with methodical precision. Violation notices arrived weekly, sometimes daily, citing increasingly absurd infractions. My dog barked too early in the morning. Though I didn't own a dog, my trash cans were visible from the road for 37 minutes longer than permitted. My dock lights created excessive glare, despite using the same fixtures my grandfather had installed in 1978. The security company Patricia had hired to patrol the lake began parking at the end of my driveway, documenting my comings and goings in a logbook they claimed was required for community safety monitoring. The financial pressure was significant, but not devastating. My consulting business was doing well, and I could afford the legal fees and fines while fighting each citation through the proper channels. What bothered me more was the isolation tactics. Patricia had somehow convinced most of the newer residents that my non-compliance was dragging down property values and threatening the community's reputation. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings stopped coming. The boat slip I'd reserved for summer 2021 was suddenly unavailable due to maintenance requirements. The grocery delivery service that served the lake community began claiming my address was outside their coverage area. The turning point came in September 2022, when Patricia filed a complaint with the county, claiming my septic system was failing and posed an environmental threat to the lake. The inspection that followed was thorough and expensive, requiring me to hire a certified environmental engineer to document that my system was not only functional but actually exceeded current environmental standards due to upgrades my grandfather had made in the 1990s. The inspector, a straightforward man named Rodriguez who'd been doing environmental assessments for 20 years, had been puzzled by the complaint. "Mr. Harrison," he'd said, reviewing his test results, "whoever reported this either has no idea what a failing septic system looks like, or they're deliberately filing false claims. Your system is better maintained than 90% of the properties I inspect, When I asked if false environmental complaints carried any legal consequences, Rodriguez had nodded grimly. Filing knowingly false reports with the county can result in fines up to $10,000 and potential criminal charges for filing false official statements. If you want to pursue it, I'd recommend documenting everything and consulting with an attorney who specializes in environmental law. That conversation had planted the seed of an idea that would eventually become Patricia's undoing. I spent the winter of 2022 doing research that went far beyond simple property law. I hired a private investigator named Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret Chen from Patricia's HOA board, who specialized in corporate and real estate fraud. Sarah's background included 15 years with the FBI's white-collar crime division before starting her own consulting practice. And she developed a reputation for uncovering financial irregularities that others missed. Real estate hoes. Sarah had explained during our first meeting, our breeding grounds for embezzlement and kickback schemes? The oversight is minimal. The financial controls are often non-existent, and board members frequently have personal financial interests that conflict with their fiduciary duties. If Patricia Middleton is as aggressive as you describe, she's probably cutting corners somewhere that could be legally problematic. Sarah's investigation took 3 months and cost me $15,000. What she uncovered was worth every penny. The Pine Lake HOA had been systematically overcharging residents for community services while directing contracts to companies owned by Patricia's relatives. The security company monitoring my driveway was owned by Patricia's brother-in-law, charging the HOA twice the market rate for services that included property surveillance, not authorized in any community agreement. The landscaping company maintaining common areas was owned by Patricia's sister, with invoices showing charges for premium organic treatments that were never actually provided. More interesting was the pattern of property acquisitions around the lake. Over the past 4 years, Patricia had orchestrated the purchase of 6 lakefront properties by creating violations and legal pressure that forced owners to sell below market value. The buyers in each case were shell companies that traced back to a real estate investment firm where Patricia's husband served as managing partner. But the most damaging discovery involved the emergency powers Patricia claimed to possess as HOA president. According to the original HOA charter filed with the county, emergency authority required approval from at least 3 board members and could only be invoked for situations involving immediate physical danger to residents or property. Patricia had been issuing emergency declarations unilaterally, without board approval, and using them to bypass normal procedural requirements for everything from violation notices to property assessments. Sarah had also discovered that Patricia's position as HOA president had technically expired 6 months earlier. The community bylaws required annual elections, but Patricia had postponed the 2022 election, citing ongoing administrative reorganization that never seemed to conclude. She'd been operating without legitimate authority for months, making every citation and fine she'd issued legally meaningless. Armed with this information, I'd consulted with James Morrison about the best way to proceed. James specialized in property law and HOA disputes, but he'd recommended bringing in a criminal attorney for the more serious charges we were considering. That's how I met Rebecca Santos, a former prosecutor who'd left the district attorney's office to focus on white-collar crime defense and had developed expertise in real estate fraud cases. What Patricia's been doing, Rebecca had explained, constitutes multiple felonies under Colorado law: filing false official statements, embezzlement of HOA funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, and potentially racketeering if we can prove the property acquisition scheme was coordinated. The challenge is building a case that prosecutors will actually pursue, which means documenting everything and getting Patricia to incriminate herself. That's why I wasn't surprised when Patricia showed up at my door with her emergency eviction notice. Sarah had been monitoring Patricia's communications through public records requests and had warned me that something big was coming. Patricia had filed incorporation papers for a new company called Pine Lake Development LLC just 2 weeks earlier, with her husband listed as the primary investor and her brother-in-law as project manager. The business plan, which was part of the public filing, outlined a luxury resort development requiring the acquisition of remaining lakefront properties, specifically including the Harrison cabin and associated acreage. The emergency ordinance Patricia was waving around had been passed at a board meeting that occurred without proper notice, without a quorum, and without any legitimate authority to make such decisions. It was the kind of obvious overreach that Rebecca had predicted would eventually give us the evidence we needed to pursue criminal charges. I looked at Patricia standing on my porch, her two companions shifting nervously behind her, and realized this was the moment she'd finally gone too far. "Patricia," I said calmly, "I think you should call your lawyer before you say anything else. What you're holding appears to be a fraudulent legal document, and I'd hate for you to compound your legal problems by continuing to make false official statements." Her face went white, then red, as the implications of my words sank in. "You can't threaten me," she sputtered. "I have every right to enforce community standards, and if you don't comply voluntarily, I'll have the sheriff remove you personally." That's when she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Yes? This is Patricia Middleton, president of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association," she said loudly enough for her companions and myself to hear clearly. "I need officers to respond to 2847 Lakeshore Drive immediately. We have a trespasser refusing to vacate property in violation of emergency community ordinances. He's being belligerent and potentially dangerous." I felt a cold satisfaction as Patricia continued her call, because everything she was saying was being recorded by the security system I'd installed 3 months earlier. Rebecca had advised me that getting Patricia to make false statements to law enforcement would be the strongest possible evidence for criminal prosecution, and Patricia was exceeding even our most optimistic expectations. The sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes, 2 experienced officers who clearly knew Patricia from previous calls. Deputy Martinez, a stocky Hispanic man in his 40s, listened patiently as Patricia explained the situation, occasionally glancing at me with the kind of expression that suggested he'd heard variations of this story before. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said when Patricia finished her explanation, "do you have documentation showing that Mr. Harrison is legally required to vacate this property?" Patricia handed over her emergency ordinance with the confidence of someone who'd never had her authority questioned. Deputy Martinez read through it carefully, then looked at his partner, Deputy Williams, with raised eyebrows. "Ma'am, this document appears to claim that the Pine Lake HOA has the authority to issue eviction notices and declare properties condemned. Is that your understanding of HOA powers?" "Absolutely," Patricia replied. "Emergency situations require immediate action to protect the community." That's when I stepped forward and handed Deputy Martinez a folder containing Sarah's investigation findings, Rebecca's legal analysis, and the documentation showing that Patricia's authority as HOA president had expired months earlier. "Officers," I said, "I believe Mrs. Middleton has been operating under some misunderstandings about her legal authority. The documents I'm providing show that she has no legitimate power to issue eviction notices, and that the emergency ordinance she's citing was created without proper authorization." Deputy Martinez spent 15 minutes reviewing the documentation, while Patricia grew increasingly agitated. When he finished, he looked at Patricia with the kind of serious expression that suggested her morning was about to get much worse. "Mrs. Middleton," he said, "filing false reports with law enforcement is a Class 2 misdemeanor under Colorado statute 18-8-111. Making false statements about emergency situations can result in additional charges. I need to inform you that anything you say from this point forward can be used against you in criminal proceedings." Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I own half this lake community. My husband's development company has invested millions in this area. Some squatter with a falling down cabin can't prevent legitimate community improvement. Deputy Williams was now taking notes, because Patricia had just admitted to using her HOA position to benefit her husband's business interests, which constituted a clear conflict of interest and potential fraud. Ma'am, Deputy Martinez continued, I'm going to need you to accompany us to the station to clarify some of these statements. Mr. Harrison, do you wish to file charges for filing a false police report? Yes, I replied, and I'd like to provide additional documentation about related fraud allegations that the district attorney's office should investigate. As Patricia was placed in handcuffs, her two companions disappeared faster than morning mist. Linda Foster and Margaret Chen clearly understood that their association with Patricia's schemes could have serious legal consequences, and they weren't interested in being collateral damage. The investigation that followed Patricia's arrest uncovered even more extensive fraud than Sarah's initial investigation had revealed. The district attorney's office, working with federal investigators, discovered that Patricia's property acquisition scheme had defrauded homeowners of over $2 million in below-market sales. Her embezzlement of HOA funds totaled nearly $400,000, most of which had been funneled to her husband's development company through fraudulent contracts. Patricia's husband, David Middleton, was arrested 3 days later on conspiracy and money laundering charges. His development company's assets were frozen pending investigation, including the 6 lakefront properties they'd acquired through Patricia's intimidation tactics. The criminal trial took 8 months, during which Patricia maintained her innocence and claimed she'd been acting in the community's best interests. The jury disagreed, convicting her on 14 counts, including fraud, embezzlement, filing false official statements, and racketeering. She was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $4 million. More satisfying than Patricia's conviction was what happened to her property. The federal asset forfeiture that followed her husband's conviction included their 6,000-square-foot lakefront mansion, which was sold at public auction to satisfy restitution claims. The winning bidder, paying $2 million, was a limited liability company I'd established for the purpose. I demolished Patricia's mansion 6 months later and donated the land to the county for a public park. The plaque at the entrance reads, Patricia Middleton Memorial Park, a reminder that community service requires humility, honesty, and respect for the rights of all residents. The Pine Lake HOA was dissolved and reorganized under new leadership, elected by actual residents rather than appointed by development companies. The new board's first official act was issuing a formal apology to the homeowners who'd been victimized by Patricia's schemes and establishing a victim compensation fund using recovered embezzlement proceeds. My cabin remains exactly as my grandfather built it, with one addition: a small plaque by the front door reading, Harrison Family Cabin, Est. 1962. Some things are not for sale. On quiet mornings, when the mist rises from the lake and the only sounds are loons calling across the water, I sit on the porch my grandfather built and remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be moved. Patricia Middleton learned that community leadership isn't about power or profit, but about service and accountability. She had 6 years in federal prison to reflect on that lesson. The rest of us learned that standing up to bullies, no matter how well connected or confident they seem, is worth the time and effort it takes to do it properly. Justice, like the morning mist on Pine Lake, takes time to rise, but when it does, it's beautiful to witness.